The sun rose over Whitmore Plantation like a judge ascending his bench, cold, impartial, and absolute. It cast long shadows across the cotton fields, where rows of white bolls stretched toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. In the distance, the big house stood like a monument to old money and older cruelties, its white columns gleaming with a pride that had been purchased with blood and sweat that was not its own. Among the field workers who emerged from the slave quarters at dawn, there was one who walked alone. His name was Elijah, though few bothered to use it. Most called him the Pale One, or that strange boy, and some didn't call him anything at all. They simply looked away, as if the very sight of him was an offense against the natural order of things. Elijah's skin was the color of cream mixed with the faintest touch of coffee, too dark to pass as white, too light to belong among those who shared his chains. His hair fell in loose curls that caught the morning light, neither straight like the master's, nor tightly coiled like his mother's had been. His eyes, a startling gray-green, seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if he existed in some middle realm where no one else could follow. He was 17 years old, and he had been unwanted for every single one of them. "Don't stand near me," Martha hissed as he approached the water barrel. She was an older woman, strong despite her years, with hands that could pick cotton faster than anyone else on the plantation. "You bring bad luck, pale thing. Everyone knows it." Elijah said nothing. He had learned long ago that words only made things worse. He filled his cup, drank quickly, and moved away before the others arrived. Better to be invisible than to be seen. The overseer, a thick-necked man named Sykes, rode up on his horse as the workers assembled for their assignments. His eyes swept over the group with practiced indifference, lingering on Elijah with something that looked like distaste. "You," Sykes pointed at Elijah with his riding crop. "Northfield. By yourself. Don't need you spooking the others with that face of yours." A few workers snickered. Elijah kept his eyes down and nodded. The North Field was the worst assignment. The soil was poor, the rows longer, and there was no shade from the merciless sun. But it was also solitary, and for that, Elijah was almost grateful. He walked the half-mile to his assigned section, his worn shoes kicking up small clouds of red dust. The morning was already hot, the air thick with moisture that promised no relief. By noon, the heat would be unbearable. By evening, his hands would be raw and bleeding, his back screaming with pain. But pain was familiar. Pain he could handle. It was the loneliness that hollowed him out. As he worked, his mind drifted to memories he wished he could forget. His mother, Sarah, had been a house servant, favored for her beauty and intelligence, which had made her both privileged and vulnerable. She had never told him who his father was, but Elijah had figured it out, the way the old master avoided looking at him, the way the mistress's face would twist with rage whenever she saw him, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. His mother had died when he was 12, and whatever small protection her position had afforded him died with her. He was moved to the fields, where he belonged to no one and nothing. The other enslaved people had rejected him from the start. To them, he was a reminder of the worst kind of violation, the kind that left evidence, that created something that belonged to neither world. He was the master's shame and their anger, walking around in human form. And the white folks? To them, he was an abomination, a mistake, a living insult to the natural order they had built their entire world upon. The morning stretched into afternoon. Elijah's hands moved mechanically, pulling the cotton bolls and stuffing them into his sack. His mind went blank, entering that state of numbness that made the hours pass without feeling them. It was a skill he had perfected over the years, the ability to be present in body, but absent in spirit. He didn't notice Sykes approaching until the man's shadow fell across him. "You're slow," the overseer said, though Elijah's sack was nearly as full as anyone else's would be at this hour. "Master Whitmore's been talking about you again. Says you're more trouble than you're worth." Elijah straightened, his back protesting the movement. He met Sykes's eyes for just a moment, long enough to show he was listening, short enough to avoid being insolent. "Says he's got half a mind to sell you," Sykes continued, circling Elijah like a predator. "But who'd buy you? You're not strong enough for hard labor, too strange-looking for housework, and too whatever you are for anything else." The overseer spat in the dirt near Elijah's feet. "You're lucky Master Whitmore's a Christian man." Anyone else would have drowned you at birth like a deformed puppy. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Words were traps. Silence was survival. Sykes waited for a reaction, seemed disappointed when he didn't get one, then rode off toward the other fields. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elijah hauled his sack to the weighing station. The overseer's assistant, a young man barely older than Elijah, weighed it without looking at him. 43 pounds, he announced, marking it in his ledger. Pathetic. It wasn't pathetic, it was average, maybe slightly above, but Elijah didn't argue. He never argued. He walked back to the quarters as twilight settled over the plantation. The other workers were already there, gathering around cooking fires, sharing the meager rations that would have to sustain them until morning. Elijah collected his portion, a piece of cornbread and some salted pork, and retreated to the edge of the quarters, where a broken-down shed provided some shelter. This was his space, such as it was. The shed had once stored tools, but after it partially collapsed, it had been abandoned. Elijah had claimed it, preferring its solitude to the hostile company of the main quarters. He ate slowly, making the food last, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing, a low, mournful melody that spoke of rivers and freedom and a better world beyond this one. The voice was beautiful, full of pain and hope in equal measure. Elijah closed his eyes and let the song wash over him. For a few moments, he could pretend he was part of something, connected to the voices that rose in harmony, carried on the night air like prayers. But when the singing stopped, the loneliness rushed back in, colder than before. He lay down on the pile of straw that served as his bed, his body aching from the day's labor. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, interrupted by dreams of faces that turned away from him, doors that closed before he could enter, and an endless searching for a place that didn't exist. The next morning began exactly like the one before, and the one before that, and the 1,000 mornings that stretched back to the beginning of his memory. But 3 weeks later, everything changed. Master Whitmore called a gathering in front of the big house. All the workers were summoned, which was unusual. Sykes stood beside the master, his face unreadable. "I've made a business decision," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the assembled group. He was an older man, his face weathered by years of sun and bourbon, his authority absolute within the boundaries of his land. "Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, a widow from the county over, has requested labor for her farm. I've agreed to sell her one worker." A ripple of anxiety moved through the group. Sales meant separation, families torn apart, futures made even more uncertain. Whitmore's eyes scanned the assembled people and stopped on Elijah. "You," he said, pointing. "Pack whatever you have, you leave at dawn tomorrow." Elijah felt every eye turn toward him. Some looked relieved, glad it wasn't them. Others looked satisfied, happy to see him gone. No one looked sad. "Mrs. Hartwell runs a small operation," Whitmore continued. "Just her and a couple of old farm hands. She needs someone young and, well, she didn't specify, and I need to clear some space. You'll do." That night, Elijah packed his belongings into a small cloth bundle. It didn't take long. A spare shirt, a tin cup, a small knife he'd found in the fields, and a button that had belonged to his mother. Everything he owned in the world fit in one hand. He didn't say goodbye to anyone because there was no one to say goodbye to. As he lay in the shed for the last time, staring up at the stars through the gaps in the roof, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. That would be too strong a word. But perhaps possibility. Somewhere out there, in a place he'd never been, was a woman who had asked for a worker without specifying what kind. A woman who didn't know what he looked like, what he was, what everyone else saw when they looked at him. Maybe, just maybe, this new place would be different. Or maybe it would be exactly the same, and he would spend the rest of his life moving from one rejection to the next, forever unwanted, forever alone. Either way, dawn would come, and with it, a journey into the unknown. The wagon rattled along the dirt road for 3 hours before the Hartwell farm came into view. Elijah sat in the back, his wrists loosely bound, more for appearance than necessity, watching the landscape change from the manicured fields of Whitmore Plantation to something wilder, less tamed. The driver, an older man named Thomas who worked for the county, hadn't spoken much during the journey. He'd given Elijah water twice and hadn't looked at him with the usual disgust, which was something. "That's it there," Thomas said, pointing toward a modest farmhouse nestled among a grove of oak trees. "Hartwell Place. Used to be twice this size before Mr. Hartwell passed. Now it's just the widow and whatever help she can afford." The house was painted white, though the paint was peeling in places. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and flower boxes sat beneath the windows, though the flowers had gone wild, untended. Behind the house, Elijah could see a barn, a chicken coop, and fields that looked like they'd been neglected for some time. It was smaller than he'd expected, quieter. The wagon came to a stop in front of the house, and Thomas climbed down. "Wait here," he instructed, though Elijah had no intention of going anywhere. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and she appeared. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell was not what Elijah had imagined. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, maybe a bit older. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with a few loose strands framing a face that was neither beautiful nor plain, but somewhere in between. She wore a simple gray dress, practical and worn, with an apron tied at her waist. But it was her eyes that caught him, dark brown, intelligent, and carrying a sadness that seemed to weigh down her entire being. She looked tired, bone-tired, in the way that comes from carrying burdens no one else can see. Thomas approached her, hat in hand. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've brought the worker from Whitmore Plantation, as arranged." Adelaide's eyes moved past Thomas to the wagon, where Elijah sat motionless. Her expression didn't change, no shock, no disgust, no surprise. She simply looked at him for a long moment, as if taking inventory. "Untie him, please," she said quietly. Thomas hesitated. "Ma'am, it's customary to—" "Untie him," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "He's not going to run." "Where would he run to?" Thomas did as instructed, removing the loose ropes from Elijah's wrists. Elijah climbed down from the wagon, his legs stiff from the journey, and stood at a respectful distance, eyes down. "What's your name?" Adelaide asked. "Elijah, ma'am," he said quietly. "How old are you?" 17, ma'am." She nodded slowly, still studying him. "Can you read?" The question surprised him. He hesitated before answering. "A little, ma'am. My mother taught me some before she passed." "And farm work? You know how to tend crops? Care for animals?" "Yes, ma'am. I've worked the field since I was 12. Adelaide was silent for a moment, then turned to Thomas. "Thank you for bringing him. I'll take it from here." Thomas tipped his hat, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove away, leaving Elijah standing alone in the yard with this strange, quiet woman who hadn't looked at him the way everyone else did. Adelaide gestured toward the barn. "You'll sleep there. It's clean, and there's a cot already set up. You'll find blankets in the trunk by the door. I'll bring you supper in an hour." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to go, then paused. "Elijah." "Yes, ma'am. I don't know what your life was like before you came here, and I won't pretend to understand it. But on this farm, you work hard, you keep to yourself, and you'll be treated fairly. That's the arrangement. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, ma'am." She nodded and walked back into the house, closing the door behind her. Elijah stood in the yard for a moment, uncertain what to make of what had just happened. Then he walked to the barn, pushed open the heavy door, and stepped inside. The barn was indeed clean, cleaner than the shed he'd been living in. The cot was in the corner, with a wool blanket folded neatly on top. There was a small window that let in light, a lantern hanging on a hook, and the smell of hay and horses, which was oddly comforting. It was better than he'd expected, much better. He set his small bundle on the cot and looked around his new home. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to relief. True to her word, Adelaide brought him supper an hour later, a plate of beans, cornbread, and a piece of chicken. It was more food than he usually got in a day. "There's a pump behind the barn," she said, setting the plate on a small table. "Water's clean. You can wash up there in the mornings." "Thank you, ma'am." She lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, but then thought better of it. "Good night, Elijah." "Good night, ma'am." The days that followed established a rhythm. Elijah woke before dawn, washed at the pump, and found his assignments written on a slate board that Adelaide left on the porch. The work was hard but manageable. Mending fences, clearing overgrown fields, repairing the chicken coop, tending to the 2 old horses that were the farm's only livestock. Adelaide kept her distance, but she was always watching. Not in the way Sykes had watched, looking for mistakes to punish. She watched like someone trying to solve a puzzle, figure out a problem she couldn't quite name. She left him meals 3 times a day, always more than he expected. She never ate with him, never invited him to the house, but the food was good and plentiful. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, he would see her on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a book in her lap, though she rarely seemed to be reading. More often, she just stared out at the fields, lost in thoughts that made her face even sadder. 3 weeks passed before they had their first real conversation. Elijah was repairing a section of fence near the house when one of the posts snapped completely, rotted through at the base. He'd need a replacement, which meant going to the woodpile near the back of the property. As he walked past the house, he heard a crash from inside, followed by a sharp cry of frustration. He hesitated. It wasn't his place to interfere, but the cry had sounded pained, not just angry. He approached the back door cautiously. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Silence. Then, "I'm fine. Please continue your work." But her voice was strained, tight with pain. Elijah stood there, torn between obedience and concern. Finally, concern won. "Ma'am, if you're hurt, I might be able to help." Another pause. Then the door opened and Adelaide stood there, her face pale, cradling her left hand against her chest. Blood was seeping through her fingers. "I was cutting vegetables and the knife slipped," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "It's nothing serious." But Elijah could see it was more than nothing. The cut was deep, and she was losing color by the second. "May I look at it, ma'am?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, pride and pain warring in her expression. Finally, she extended her hand. The cut ran across her palm, deep enough to need stitching. Elijah had seen enough injuries in the fields to know what needed to be done. "You'll need to sit down, ma'am," he said gently, "and I'll need clean cloth, needle and thread, and whiskey if you have it. I'm perfectly capable of—" "Ma'am, with respect, you're about to faint. Please sit." Something in his voice, calm, competent, concerned, made her comply. She sat at the kitchen table while Elijah gathered the supplies she directed him to. He cleaned the wound carefully, his hands steady despite the intimacy of the moment. This was the closest he'd ever been to her, the first time he'd been inside the house. He could smell lavender soap and something else. Loneliness, maybe, though that might have been his imagination. "This will hurt," he warned before pouring whiskey over the cut. She gasped, but didn't pull away. He stitched the wound with small, careful movements, the way his mother had once shown him. Adelaide watched his face while he worked, and for the first time Elijah felt truly seen, not as a problem or an anomaly, but as a person with skill and value. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked quietly. "My mother. She worked in the big house and sometimes helped with the doctor when he came. She taught me some things before she died. I'm sorry about your mother." They were simple words, but no one had ever said them to him before. His throat tightened. "Thank you, ma'am." When he finished, he bandaged her hand with clean cloth and stepped back. "You should rest it for a few days. Try not to use it if you can help it." Adelaide looked at her bandaged hand, then at Elijah. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was very kind. Just doing what needed doing, ma'am." She stood, steadier now, and walked him to the door. But before he could leave, she spoke again. "Elijah, why do you always look down when you speak to me?" The question caught him off guard. "It's respectful, ma'am. It's what's expected." "Expected by whom?" "Everyone, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. "When you're here, on this farm, you can look at me when we speak. I'd prefer it, actually. It's difficult to have a conversation with the top of someone's head." Slowly, Elijah raised his eyes to meet hers. In that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of one. Two lonely people, each carrying wounds that couldn't be stitched. "Yes, ma'am," he said, holding her gaze. She nodded, almost smiled, then closed the door. Elijah walked back to the fence, his hands shaking slightly from what had just happened. Something had changed in that kitchen, something subtle but profound. For the first time in his life, someone had looked at him and seen past the color of his skin to the person underneath. It was terrifying, and it was the most hopeful thing that had ever happened to him. The seasons changed slowly on the Hartwell farm, each day bleeding into the next with a rhythm that was both monotonous and comforting. Summer's oppressive heat gave way to autumn's cooler breezes, and with the changing weather came something neither Elijah nor Adelaide had anticipated, a friendship that defied every rule they'd ever known. It started small, Adelaide began leaving books on the porch along with Elijah's assignments. Simple volumes at first, testing whether his claim about reading was true. When she found them returned each morning with the pages carefully turned and the spines respected, she left more challenging works. Philosophy, poetry, even a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. "What did you think of Hamlet?" she asked one morning as she brought him breakfast. It had been 2 months since he'd arrived, and these brief conversations had become part of their routine. Elijah looked up from the fence he was mending, meeting her eyes as she'd requested. "I think he thought too much about doing and not enough about living. All that planning and questioning, and in the end everyone died anyway." Adelaide's eyebrows raised slightly. "That's a rather pragmatic interpretation. Maybe. Or maybe I just don't have the luxury of thinking that much before acting. Some of us have to live with the consequences too fast to philosophize about them." She considered this, her head tilting slightly. "Perhaps you're wiser than Hamlet, then. Or maybe just more practical, ma'am." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her features, making her look younger, less burdened. "Adelaide," she said quietly. "Ma'am, when it's just us, you can call me Adelaide. Mrs. Hartwell makes me feel ancient." Elijah hesitated. The informality was dangerous, a crossing of lines that existed for reasons neither of them could ignore. But her eyes held something like hope, and he found he couldn't deny her. "Adelaide," he repeated, the name feeling strange and intimate on his tongue. She nodded, satisfied, and walked back to the house. But Elijah noticed she glanced back twice before going inside. The first frost came in late October, coating the farm in a glittering silver blanket. Elijah woke to find Adelaide already at the barn door, her breath misting in the cold air. "The old mare is sick," she said without preamble. "I don't know what's wrong with her." They went to the stable together, where Daisy, the older of the 2 horses, lay on her side, breathing shallowly. Elijah knelt beside her, running his hands over her body, checking for fever, swelling, signs of distress. "Colic, I think," he said after a few minutes. "Bad, but not hopeless. We need to get her up and walking. Keep her moving so her gut doesn't twist." For the next 6 hours, they worked together in silent coordination. Adelaide held the horse's lead while Elijah coaxed her to her feet. They walked her in slow circles around the barn, taking turns when one grew tired. Adelaide brewed herbal teas that Elijah administered with patient gentleness. They spoke little, but their movements were synchronized, each anticipating what the other needed. By evening, Daisy was standing on her own, drinking water, showing signs of recovery. Adelaide collapsed onto a hay bale, exhausted. Elijah sat nearby, close enough to talk but far enough to maintain propriety, though that distance was shrinking with each passing day. "Thank you," Adelaide said quietly. "I couldn't have saved her without you. You would have figured it out." "No," she shook her head. "I wouldn't have. I'm not good at this. Any of this. Running a farm, being alone, knowing what to do when things go wrong." Her voice cracked slightly. "Robert always handled everything. I was just supposed to look pretty and manage the house. And now he's gone and I'm drowning. And I don't know how to ask for help because asking means admitting I'm failing." It was the most vulnerable she'd ever been with him. Elijah felt the weight of her confession, the trust it represented. "You're not failing," he said gently. "You're surviving. That's different." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. "How do you do it? Survive, I mean. After everything you've been through. And don't tell me you haven't been through terrible things, I can see it in your eyes. How do you keep going?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. No one had ever asked him that before. No one had ever cared enough to ask. "I don't know that I do keep going," he said finally. "Most days I just exist. I wake up, I work, I sleep. I don't think about tomorrow because tomorrow's not mine to plan. But lately," he paused, uncertain if he should continue. "Lately what?" "Lately I wake up, and I think about the books you'll leave, the conversations we might have, whether you'll smile at something I say, and that's not just existing anymore, that's something else." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Adelaide's eyes were locked on his, and in them he saw his own dangerous hope reflected back. "Elijah," she whispered, I know what it is," he interrupted gently, "and I know what it can't be. I'm not foolish enough to forget my place." "Your place," she repeated bitterly. "Your place. as if humanity can be measured by skin color and circumstance, as if some people are meant to be lonely forever because society has decided that's how things should be. She stood abruptly, agitated. Do you know what it's like? To be a widow at 29? To have people look at you with pity or suspicion? To know that the rest of your life is supposed to be spent in gray dresses and quiet rooms, never laughing too loud, never wanting too much, just fading away until you're a ghost in your own house? Elijah stood as well, maintaining the careful distance. I know what it's like to be invisible, to have people look through you like you're not there, to wonder if you'll ever matter to anyone. You matter, Adelaide said fiercely. You matter to me. The words hung between them like a confession and a condemnation all at once. November brought rain, and with it, necessity. The roof of the main house developed a leak, and Elijah spent 3 days repairing it. Working inside the house broke another unspoken barrier. Adelaide moved through the rooms while he worked, and they talked about books, about the farm, about carefully neutral topics that skirted around the feelings growing between them. But one afternoon, as Elijah balanced on a ladder in the hallway, Adelaide brought him water and asked the question he'd been dreading. What happened to your father? His hands stilled on the beam he was securing. Why do you want to know? Because you never mention him. You talk about your mother with such tenderness, but your father is a ghost in your stories. Elijah climbed down from the ladder slowly, accepting the water glass. His hands trembled slightly. My father, he said carefully, was the master of Whitmore Plantation. He watched her face, waiting for the disgust, the pity, the judgment. But Adelaide's expression remained steady, though her eyes darkened with understanding. He never acknowledged you, she said. It wasn't a question. He couldn't, or wouldn't. To him, I was evidence of his sin. To his wife, I was a reminder of betrayal. To my mother, his voice caught. To my mother, I was everything. But she paid the price for my existence every day. She was never treated the same after I was born. And when she died, whatever small protection I had died with her. Adelaide set down her own glass and did something extraordinary. She reached out and took his hand, the first time she'd touched him since he'd stitched her wound months ago. I'm sorry, she said simply. I'm sorry for what was done to you and to your mother. I'm sorry that the world is so cruel to people who didn't choose the circumstances of their birth. Elijah looked down at their joined hands, her pale skin against his, the difference that defined everything about their lives. Adelaide, this is dangerous. If anyone saw, let them see, she said with sudden defiance. I'm tired of living by rules made by people who've never had to sacrifice their own happiness. You don't understand what they'd do to you. The scandal, the isolation. I'm already isolated. I'm already living in scandal's shadow because I'm a widow who didn't produce an heir, who couldn't keep her husband from drinking himself into an early grave, who has the audacity to try running a farm alone. What more can they take from me? Everything, Elijah said quietly, pulling his hand away despite the ache it caused. They can take everything, and they will, if we're not careful. But careful became increasingly difficult as winter approached. The farm required them to work closely, and proximity bred intimacy. They developed private jokes, shared knowing glances, found excuses to be near each other. The first snow came in early December, transforming the farm into something magical. Adelaide stood on the porch watching it fall, and Elijah approached with wood for the fireplace. It's beautiful, she said softly. It is. But he wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at her, the way the white flakes caught in her dark hair, the wonder in her eyes, the vulnerability of her posture. She turned and caught him staring. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Adelaide stepped closer, erasing the careful distance they'd maintained. Tell me to stop, she whispered. Elijah's heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct screamed danger, but he couldn't move away. Adelaide, tell me this is wrong. Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me I'm alone in this madness. You're not alone, he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep inside. You've never been alone in this. Her hand rose to his face, fingertips barely touching his cheek. The gesture was so tender it hurt. We can't, Elijah said, but he didn't step back. I know. It would destroy you. I'm already destroyed. You're the first thing that's made me feel alive in years. The truth of it was undeniable, but so was the danger. The moment shattered when they heard hoofbeats on the road. Adelaide jerked back, and Elijah stepped away quickly, putting proper distance between them. A rider appeared through the snow. Thomas, the man who'd brought Elijah to the farm months ago. "Mrs. Hartwell," Thomas called, dismounting. "Just checking on you before the storm gets worse. Roads might be impassable for a few days." "I'm fine, Thomas. Thank you for your concern." Thomas's eyes moved to Elijah, and something flickered in his expression. Suspicion, perhaps, or calculation. Thomas's suspicion grew into whispers. By February, neighboring farmers spoke in hushed tones about the widow and her pale worker. The careful distance Adelaide and Elijah maintained couldn't erase what people chose to see. One frozen morning, 3 men arrived, the county overseer and 2 officials. They found Elijah in the barn. "You're coming with us," the overseer announced. "There's been complaints. Inappropriate conduct." Adelaide ran from the house, her face pale. "He's done nothing wrong. I won't let you take him." "Ma'am, you don't have a choice. The arrangement's being terminated." Adelaide's hands trembled. "Then I'm terminating it myself. I'm setting him free." Silence fell like the snow around them. "You can't," the overseer began. "I can. This is my property, my decision. I'm manumitting him. Now." Inside, Adelaide wrote the papers with shaking hands. Elijah stood frozen, understanding the magnitude of what she was doing and what it would cost her. "Adelaide, they'll destroy you for this," he whispered. "Then I'll be destroyed, but you'll be free." She signed the papers, pressed them into his hands along with money she couldn't spare. "Go north. Tonight. Don't look back. Come with me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't. This farm, it's all I have of Robert and you. You deserve a life that isn't shadowed by what we are, what we can't be, what we already are," he corrected gently. She touched his face one last time. "Then carry me with you, and live the life I can't." That night, Elijah walked away from the only place that had ever felt like home. Behind him, Adelaide stood on the porch, watching until he disappeared into the darkness. She would face the scandal alone. He would carry her courage north. Both would survive. Both would remember. And years later, Elijah would tell the story of a lonely widow who had seen what no one else could. Not a slave, but a man. Not a mistake, but a miracle. The price of their freedom had been each other. But the gift was that they had loved it all.